Hey everyone, so I noticed this clip making the rounds on YouTube a couple of nights ago. Richard Dawkins apparently took part in some event in Brooklyn, New York, called Dissonant Dialogues, I believe. And a lot of other big names took part as well. John McWhorter, Steven Pinker, Ian Hersey Ali, Brianna Greyjoy, I believe Alex O'Connor, aka Cosmic Skeptic. Imagine Alex O'Connor and Richard Dawkins walking through Brooklyn. Hey, you frickin' eggheads are a little far from home, ain't ya? That's my stereotypical guy from Brooklyn. I kid, I too am from the East Coast. But after the event, a reporter approached him, meaning Dawkins, in the airport and asked him about comments he supposedly made on stage, in which he characterized the recent pro Palestinian protests, that was a lot of alliteration, on college campuses, more alliteration, as being anti Semitic. But I'll play the clip now.
Do a quick question?
Yeah.
All right. You said you felt that the students protesting were driven by anti Semitism.
Yes.
Do you feel it's possible they're driven by horror at the slaughter in Gaza?
Do what? Sorry.
Do you think they're driven by horror at the slaughter in Gaza? Is it necessarily anti Semitism?
Of course, they're not driven by the horror and the slaughtering. You mean?
Of the students protesting?
Well, are you recording this? I'm not. Put that away. I don't do recordings.
Okay.
And so I find that clip depressing on a number of levels. I'm someone who admires people who, in their advanced age, still retain their mental sharpness, still have their wits about them, are still eloquent. People like, even if you disagree with their politics, Bernie Sanders, Noam Chomsky, or people like David Attenborough, Gabor Mate. I've seen interviews with Holocaust survivors giving their opinions on what's going on in Gaza recently. And I've been impressed by how sharp and eloquent and insightful they still are. People like that give me hope about what my later years might possibly be like and make me less afraid of aging. And even though I disagree with some of his recent takes on social issues, Dawkins was one of those people who inspired me in that sense as well. And he has his own podcast, and I remember seeing him being interviewed by Alex O'Connor a few months ago, and he seemed as sharp as ever, so it's weird and sad to suddenly see him acting so easily flustered, like a confused older person on the verge of a tantrum. In fairness, I don't know if it is indicative of some age related personality change or cognitive issue. Maybe he just felt embarrassed or offended when he realized he was being called out and wanted to quickly find a way out of the conversation. But yeah, it was very strange the way it unfolded. The interviewer asks him if it could be the case that the student protesters aren't anti Semitic, but rather they're just opposed to the slaughter and carnage taking place in Gaza, and I'm paraphrasing a bit. So, a very straightforward and fair question, in my opinion. And I'm glad he asked it because it seems like, and it's kind of scary, that the mainstream media is or are trying to paint these protests as if they're anti Semitic. You have people like Dana Bash on CNN comparing them to 1930s Germany, etc. And they conveniently seem to leave out facts like how many of the students protesting the war in Gaza or Israel's actions in Gaza are themselves Jewish, including some of the organizers and those who have been arrested. The group Jewish Voice for Peace has been active on some campuses, standing with pro-Palestinian protesters, more alliteration. I personally found it moving how around Passover, there were even Jewish student protesters holding Passover seders in which they literally broke bread, shared matzah with their non-Jewish brothers and sisters. And then just recently, third-party presidential candidate Jill Stein, a Jewish woman in her 70s, was roughed up by the police while standing in solidarity with the pro-Palestinian protesters. Drink every time I do that, that alliteration with all the P's. So to make the blanket statement that these protests are anti-Semitic, to me is outrageous and dishonest. And if there are any incidents of actual anti Semitism taking place, hurling anti Semitic slurs, denigrating Jewish students because of their ethnicity or faith, that should be denounced. That should always be considered unacceptable. But the tricky thing is, we've had people trying to broaden the definition of anti Semitism. I think in Congress, didn't we just have some kind of bill or act that they were trying to push through? I think it actually may have passed, that would broaden the definition of anti Semitism on college campuses to include controversial slogans or chants like "from the river to the sea" or "Intifada." And I say controversial because whether or not such slogans or chants are anti Semitic seems to be in the eye or ear of the beholder. Some people say intifada simply means uprising, or it's a call for Palestinian liberation or freedom. Those on the opposing side will say that it's a call for violence against Israel, and they'll use past intifadas as an example. Although I believe at least the first intifada was, at least initially, largely nonviolent. It involved large-scale acts of civil disobedience, nonviolent protests, demonstrations, boycotts, and labor strikes. And the Second Intifada was considerably more violent in nature. And then the slogan or chant "from the river to the sea," those on the pro-Palestinian side will say it's just, similarly, it's a call for Palestinian freedom or liberation, while those on the other side will argue that it's a call for the violent eradication of the state of Israel. But some see this attempt, and I personally tend to agree, to broaden the definition of what constitutes anti Semitism to include such slogans as a cynical attempt to make it easier to try to shut down these pro Palestinian protests, drink up, unless you're driving, or punish student protesters. And I know I shouldn't be joking, but all the alliteration is making me kind of self conscious. All those plosive P's. But to get back to Richard Dawkins' response, yeah, it was very strange. The encounter starts off rather cordially. Dawkins seems at ease and perfectly happy to stop and talk, to his credit. And then the reporter asks that question, and it seems like at first Dawkins is trying to good-naturedly process the bit about, could it be that they're just opposed to the slaughter and carnage? And he's like, of course they're not just opposed to the slaughter or whatever. And then suddenly it's like a switch is flipped and he becomes all shaky and excited. And he's like, "Are you recording this? I don't do recordings." And he quickly walks off and the reporter's like, kind of puzzled. Okay. And I never realized until I was just trying to imitate him how much Richard Dawkins sounds like Anthony Daniels or C-3PO. "Of course God doesn't exist, R2. Don't be ridiculous." A little cringy, I admit, but I had to do it. Yeah, the "I don't do recordings" part is very strange. I know I'm saying very strange a lot. You can drink whenever I say that, too. This guy that's, he's been a public figure most of his adult life. He's had several TV shows and documentary series, taken part in countless public debates and interviews. He has a podcast and has been a guest on many podcasts. Now, in fairness to him, I guess it could mean he just doesn't like being filmed without his permission, which is very understandable. But on the other hand, once again, he's a public figure, and everyone and their mother has a smartphone with a camera in it nowadays. And the guy wasn't the paparazzi, and he was asking a pretty damn good question that should have been easy enough to answer. You would think someone who's, perhaps even on the pro-Israel side, who's intellectually honest, would be able to admit, grudgingly at least, that yeah, at least some of them, I guess it's technically possible, are there not because they're anti-Semites, but because they oppose the carnage and devastation unfolding in Gaza. And I have to admit, I sometimes feel self-conscious using terms like pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel because it kind of makes it sound like you're for one people or region and against the other, when I like to think of myself as pro-human. I don't want civilians or innocents on either side dying, but obviously I think when people say pro-Palestinian, they mean parity and equality for Palestinians or an end to Israel's devastating heavy-handed military campaign in Gaza. I guess by that definition, I'm pro-Palestinian, but I'm certainly not anti the Israeli people, just the actions of the government or leadership. And there's Israeli peace activists and human rights groups like B'Tselem who are sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. And currently, there's thousands of Israelis protesting Netanyahu's or their leadership's actions and their failure to bring the hostages home. But yeah, like I was saying, that was kind of depressing in a couple of ways. One, because of how startled and flustered Dawkins seemed, his kind of undignified lack of composure. And also because he seemed to be regurgitating this mainstream media talking point that the protests are anti Semitic. But I think that will do it for this episode. And why don't I close it out by playing the clip one last time?
A quick question.
Yeah.
All right. You said you felt that the students protesting were driven by anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Do you feel it's possible they're driven by horror at the slaughter in Gaza?
Do what? Sorry.
Do you think they're driven by horror at the slaughter in Gaza? Is it necessarily anti-Semitism?
Of course, they're not driven by the horror and the slaughtering. Oh, you mean?
Of the students protesting?
Well, are you recording this? I'm not. Put that away. I don't do recordings.
Okay.